I'm Matt Burns, Managing Editor at TechCrunch. Welcome to our first Pitchdeck Teardown. I'm so excited to be hosting this. This has been a long time in the making. And the central idea of this whole panel, it's in the name. We are, or rather Amy and Talia, will tear down pitch decks submitted by early stage attendees. These are not theoretical decks. These are real decks submitted by attendees to this conference. It's fantastic, and we're excited to have this. We get to watch as these two venture capitalists talk through these decks, what works, what doesn't work, what colors are great, what colors are bad, what fonts are good, what fonts are bad. But because of technology limitations, we're unable to have the people that submitted these decks in the chat with us. However, Amy and Talia will get feedback as if the person is in the room with us. The chat and Q&A functions are open, and we'll do our best to monitor those. But bear with us. This is the first time we've done this type of presentation, but it's going to be great. Or it won't, but it's going to be good. So let me give brief introductions, and then I'll get off the camera and we'll get started. Amy Saper joined Excel in 2019 and focuses on consumer-facing startups, API-focused companies, enterprise SaaS businesses with a focus on building delightful user experiences. Before Excel, she was the second marketing hire at Stripe, where she helped build and grow the marketing team. Talia Goldberg has been a Bessemer since 2012, where she focuses on early and growth stage software, consumer, marketplace investments. In college, she was the founding partner of the Dorm Room Fund, the First Round Capital's student-run investment fund. And with that, thank you for joining us. And let's get started with the first deck submitted by Centrally. And now this is where I have to awkwardly load things on my computer and not have dead air. So you're going to listen to all of this. Amy, Talia, are you ready to go?
Ready.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So the idea here is we're going to run through this deck quickly so everybody can see it. And I looked through a lot of pitch decks too for Startup Battlefield, and I know that we only take a few seconds per screen. So here we go.
Cool. So I'm just going to share some brief stream of consciousness thoughts. So this is the setup. It sounds like this is maybe more of a voiceover, so a story about, couldn't there be a better way? Now we're talking a little bit about the problem, getting into the product set. Looks like there might be a demo involved. Okay, great. So I'm going to have some questions about market opportunity, business model, competitive landscape. I'll definitely want to go back to. And the team slide. Great, pretty straightforward. So Matt, if we could go back, let's start with slide 2. So I think just talking about the setup here. So I do think a story hook is an interesting way to pique the investor's attention. I think it helps make the problem more real. I think this might be something that's better explained in person than as an email. So I guess at a high level, a great pitch deck can serve a few purposes. So first, it can help catch a VC's attention such that he or she will decide to take a meeting with you after checking out the deck over email. And then it can also help guide the conversation and ideally paint a picture of why your company is uniquely compelling and worthy of an investment. But let's go to slide 5 now that we've sort of set up what the problem is. So this is one where at a high level, I do think it's a little bit visually confusing. So I would suggest maybe going over the deck with a designer. You can even find someone for a couple $100 on Upwork, but I'm someone who pays a lot of attention to design. And so I think that using text and font and images to better paint the picture is really helpful. But one thing that stood out for me on this slide was that it's a daily challenge totaling to at least $250,000 a year. So that number caught my attention, and I have a couple of questions. Is this an individual customer license? Is this the budget for a team or a company? I'm hoping that is not the total addressable market. Otherwise, this is probably not a venture scalable business. But let's just assume you're saying that this is going to be something that a customer, it's the average contract value or the ACV is $250K a year. Then that automatically makes me think about, how many users you would need to attract to your business in order to achieve, say, $100 million in revenue as a benchmark. And that's, 400 in this case. So then I'm going to have questions around how many of these people are there, and what is the likelihood that you can attract a substantial portion of them? But let's go to the slide 7, please. because slides 6 and 7 are both sort of setting up the product and showing a couple of screenshots. This is one where I actually think a quick demo might be a useful way to demonstrate the product if you're presenting this live. I think demos can be really great ways to show, not tell, the value that you're delivering to customers. Every investor is different. I have a product background, so I'm a little bit biased here, but I think it's a really helpful way to get a sense of your product sensibilities. I might ask a couple of questions. I would keep this really high level if it's a first pitch. So just a couple of minutes, unless you're demoing the onboarding, I would make sure you're logged in, you have dummy data ready to go. The investor might follow up and do a longer follow-up session on the product itself. But I do think that can be a quick way to just demonstrate what you're building. And also it can show if you have a product that's built. We certainly invest pre-product, but I do think that there's a correlation between an ability to really quickly get an MVP out to market and your ability to kind of move quickly and iterate over time. So that's always something that I like to see if it's available. One other question, I guess, one other point to state rather, when it comes to demos in terms of product, sometimes I think asking the entrepreneur what you're deciding not to do and not to build is just as instructive as what features you have chosen to include in the first version of your demo, because I think that ruthless prioritization is so important in the early days. But let's go on to the competitive landscape. So in slide 8, or the market size, and then I'll contrast this with the competitive landscape. So one thing that caught my eye on this market opportunity slide is that she includes the market not just for other software tools or companies, but also analyst salaries, event fees, and so forth, which I think is really clever because you want to talk about all of the various alternatives that a customer has for solving your problem and how you fit in. And so I would actually contrast that with slide 10, which was the competitive landscape, because on the one hand, this is a bit visually distracting as currently displayed. I think there are kind of clear ways to show this, and maybe you follow up with a more in-depth competitive analysis. But on this slide, she's only listing other companies, when in many cases, your potential customer might be solving this by hiring people or by using spreadsheets or other tools that aren't necessarily custom built for this purpose. And so I think it's helpful to have a complete overview of all of the different options that a customer has to solve this particular problem.
Amy, real quick, I have a question on this one. Is this too busy? Is there too much information on the screen?
Yes, there's too much information on this screen for this version. This might be something that you could put in the appendix if you want to do a feature by feature comparison. But I think when you're first talking about the competitive landscape at a high level in an early pitch deck, I would like something that's a little bit easier to just skim on the surface that shows what the other options are and ideally what their shortcomings are, why your solution is better. Why is there a real need for your problem right now, for your solution right now? And then let's just talk about slide 11, the last slide, I believe, the team slide. So one, I really like how she includes why centrally. I think founder market fit is so important, especially at the early stages. Building a company is really, really hard. And I want to know that you are specifically passionate about this idea and are willing to dedicate the next decade plus of your life to it. One thing on solo founders, we've definitely backed solo founders before, but I do think that part of building a enduring technology company, a huge part is going to be attracting a team. And so I would like to see maybe a little bit more context if you have, even if it's part-time contractors or other people that you're working with or other advisors, or some description of who the next hires are, because I think that it's just an important conversation to have. And I guess on that point, a couple of things that now having gone through the whole deck that I would have hoped to see would be something related to traction. Do you have any customers? Do you have any revenue? Have you built the product? You're just starting to have conversations. And then something about fundraising history. I actually don't see an ask here. So it would be great to know, have you raised anything to date? What are you raising now? And how are you planning on using those funds?
Fantastic. Talia, do you have any feedback?
You know, overall, I think Amy did a great job summarizing the feedback here. You know, the one thing that I might have commented on as well, if you go to, I don't know the exact slide number, but the one that described the market opportunity. I also really liked how this was framed with kind of the specific kind of potential where you start with one market and then have the opportunity to expand beyond that. I noticed that this was kind of focused here on the US energy industry. But the one thing that kind of caught my eye there is that nothing in the deck prior to that described, this product specifically within the energy industry. It seems like a more kind of broader use case and a product that was a bit more general in the market. And so when I got to this slide and I was suddenly looking at the energy industry, I found myself scratching my head trying to understand, well, what's the use case specific to energy? Like, what's the wedge in here? And so I think painting a little bit more of that picture earlier on would help tell the story really nicely.
Good. Now this deck has 11 slides. Is that on average that you see? Is that too many, too little?
I think, in general, we see everything from probably, 10 on the lower end or 8 to 10 on the low end to 20 on the high end. I think having too many slides can be really overwhelming, and you find yourself digging through trying to figure out what's actually important, and too few slides, like there's not enough information. But I think overall, I think this was an appropriate number.
Amy, you're shaking your head in agreement.
Yeah,
So I
agree. I agree.
Great. Any last thoughts here? We're gonna move on.
No, I think we covered it.
All right, fantastic. Let's do the next one then. This is called the charging company. And once again, we're gonna run through this, but Talia's gonna take the lead on this one.
All right, so we can just go through. So here you describe the problem, and then on to the solution, showing how you're going to solve the problem, a bit of a product slide and overview. I think going into a bit more detail into the product here and how it actually works, what customers do. The business model. And then the slide goes into the key competitive differentiators in the market size and opportunity, the plan for launch, go to market, how's it actually going to get the products into the hands of customers, the opportunity even beyond the first horizon of the business, and a team slide, including their advisors. And I think that's the end of the deck.
Okay, great.
Great.
So we'll go back to the beginning here.
So, first, if you go to this next slide, I think that overall, I love that you outline the problem first. I think showing, there's a problem here, prices are rising, and really it's something that I think is pretty well known and pervasive, and everyone understands the pain of having consumers rising costs. So I love that. It's a great way to start the deck, is just to show why there's a big problem. One thing that I would think about doing to really drive that slide home and make it even more clear is to use data around it to show the magnitude of the problem and personalize it a bit more. Show to what degree are they rising and how does that impact the average person. I think it helps to humanize the problem and also paint the opportunity a bit more clearly with some quantitative information added here as well.
So to me, you're saying add more data to this. Right now, this slide is very basic, and you're looking for more data here.
Yeah, I'd love to see this slide quantify the problem a bit more, and then also personalize it a bit more. For the average consumer, what does this mean? What does it mean that energy prices are rising for their daily life? Is it rising, it's $1 more expensive, or is it, hundreds of dollars more expensive? And how does that impact the average family?
Great.
And then going into the solution, how you solve your product. When we meet with founders at an early stage, one of the most important things to us is that they can really clearly explain and identify the product that they're building and explain it in simple layman's terms. So this is what it does, not using super fancy jargon, but just it's super easy to understand. We can oftentimes there's the saying that even if there's a really complex problem, the people that can describe the issue and the solution to a child and to a 5-year-old, those are the people that often do the best job. And so, for all founders out there that might be listening, I'd encourage you, just to take the time as you go through your own pitch deck and your slides to practice with people that are totally outside of the tech industry. You may be, and it just really helps you refine your pitch and make sure that you're explaining your solution really clearly, and that people come away with a super clear view on what the product actually delivers on and what it actually does. And that's important because the VCs that you pitch to as well, some of them may be super well versed in the particular area or market in which you're operating, but some may spend a lot of their time in a different area, or you may be creating the market. And so being able to do that is really important.
Now, this looks like a demo to me. Is it okay for people to embed videos?
So I think it depends. If you're emailing the deck, I think you can expect that someone could click a link and see a video if they so chose to. But sometimes if you're presenting in person, it may be more challenging with tech equipment and whatnot to actually get things to play. So I think you can certainly have a link, but I would also be sure that whatever the slide is here is maybe a screenshot that's actually of the product or the look and the feel of it, not just this looks a little bit fuzzier. So maybe something just a little crisper that tells a story even without clicking the link.
Good point. Is there anything else on this deck that you want to highlight?
Product. The other thing I noticed is on the specific launch time, it showed right there, yeah. It'd be great to have content here and just sort of show, what money you might need to get to hit certain milestones and what those milestones are. So what do you need to do to actually get the product to launch? What are the milestones that you look to achieve over the next horizon? And oftentimes, we'll frame for founders that at least thinking about 24 months ahead. There's sort of 6 months, 12 months, 24 months is a great way to frame the timeline. But not just by time, but also by the milestones. So it'd be awesome to see what milestones you'd achieve within that period.
Good. The market size slide is something that we see in every deck. What do you think of this one?
So I love that you have just really clearly a big, bold number there that gets your attention. 220 million is a big number. Investors love big numbers, and so that's attractive and good to see kind of some different ways of breaking down the prices for consumers in different markets in Europe. I think one thing that can be helpful is to translate these numbers though also into dollars. Having the consumers with understanding what this actually means in terms of the total addressable market size for your business with your business model. I think in this case, it was a 15% premium on top of a specific price point. And so the one thing that I came away wondering and hoping that I would be able to ask the founder is, well, how does these 220 million people, if all of them were using our product with the pricing that you outlined and the business model that you outlined, what does that mean in terms of potential revenue for the business?
Great. So, Amy, do you have any feedback from this?
Yeah, I had a couple of other things that might be worth highlighting. So if we go back to slide 1 to 2, I am not really sure what this company does until a bit later in the deck. And I think Talia sort of alluded to this. Again, I'm a product marketer by background, so I think core product marketing principles are really useful when fundraising and just being really clear on what you're building and who it's for. But I think a succinct descriptor, a one-sentence tagline, I think if you go back to the first slide, I think it's something like, the power of savings, which doesn't really tell me. It could be a consumer fintech app, if you will. So to the extent that you can make that a little bit clearer, I think it helps kind of set the context for the deck. And then if we skip ahead, oh, sorry.
Well, how big of a problem do you see that? How many decks do you see that you click through and you have no idea what the company does?
I'd say more than I would like. That typically you can kind of figure it out, but ideally, if within a couple of seconds you can make it clear, sort of what problem you're solving, and then I can kind of find confirming details later. It just helps because you don't want the VC to be spending the first couple of minutes or seconds flipping through your deck just asking themselves the question of, what is this? It's better if I have kind of some frame of reference in mind when I am kind of evaluating the deck. So I do think that it's important.
Talia smiled, so I assume she agrees too.
No, I definitely agree. Look, like you're trying to get a deck seen. People are busy. They've got a ton of emails to answer. And so making it super simple for that person to understand, you know, what you do, understand what your product does in a simple tagline. Sometimes using analogies is really helpful, like the this for that. Sometimes it's too simplistic, but you know, these are just easy ways to think about how you might really quickly explain what your company does and catch the eye of a busy investor, busy potential prospect or customer, or whoever it might be.
Great.
Yeah,
Amy,
great.
you had one more thing and then we're going to move on.
So just one quick thing. On page 7, we're talking about margin, fee, and structure. So I think depending on the type of early stage business, I typically won't go down deep rabbit holes around unit economics and margin, et cetera. However, I do think that if it's a marketplace business where you're talking about a take rate or an additional fee, here they talk about how this fee covers fixed costs, data analytics, expert support, and margin. I'm immediately gonna have a question around what portion of that they think margin will be, and whether, you know, they've really thought through whether this is going to be a sustainable business and what underlies that. If you're talking about a SaaS business with 80% margins, I probably won't go into that level of detail. But for marketplace businesses, I do like to see a little bit more context on what that 15% fee in this case will go towards.
To me, having a question isn't a terrible thing because it gets a conversation going. Do you like to see? Do you see in decks, do you like to have every answer answered?
No, absolutely not. I think it's kind of a flag.
Okay.
And sometimes I do think it can be helpful if it's a question that is particularly common, and I would definitely suggest running through your deck with other, you know, investors or friends before talking to VCs. But that's one where I would love to see, you know, an easy slide in the appendix or something to refer to if you get that question.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on to the next one so we can hit all these.
Great, let's do it.
The next one is called food group. Those people are not social distancing. So here we go.
Yep. Okay, so it's a marketplace, consumers and diners. Here's some description of the product on both sides of the marketplace. Okay, we're talking about the why now. Love seeing traction slides. Definitely going to go back to the market opportunity, business model. Okay. Go to market strategy. Yep.
Well, that's interesting.
Have
you seen any COVID-19 appendixes or slides?
I have. I think if you're talking about a business where you know that this question will come up, I think it's important to kind of tackle it head on. We're long-term investors, so we're, you know, ideally investing where we're going to be in the company for the next 10 plus years, but I do think it's still important to at least reference. Okay, funding requirements. Great, awesome. So lots of, you know, they generally have all the pieces that I would like to see. Let's go back, I guess, just because I just mentioned it on slide 1. I think they did a nice job with the descriptor here. Connecting restaurants and diners before the meal is served. I'm already thinking that this is a marketplace, that it's multi-sided, that it's consumer facing, and so forth. I am also going to immediately have some questions because they're targeting restaurants, and I do think that they are historically a tricky customer set, but obviously given the current environment, I might have questions about willingness to pay. So let's go into slides 4 to 5. I think they did a nice job of walking through, to Talia's earlier point, you want to be able to describe in really simple terms how your product works. And so for because it's a marketplace, they have one slide where they're talking about the experience on the restaurant side, and it's really clear with some kind of visualizations of what the product looks like. And then similarly on the consumer side. So I think that's a helpful way to frame it here. But on slide 6, there was something that caught my eye. I think this is where they're talking about why now. So here, I care deeply about who the customer is, how well you understand their problems and needs. On trend 3, when you're talking about restaurants and software, I would have some questions about what the biggest challenges are facing restaurants and why you think they are particularly underserved. I think, if you imagine in this case, a Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a restaurant, especially right now in the current environment, I would imagine they're really, really focused on ROI. And so I'm not sure how connecting with consumers, no existing solutions for connecting to consumers or consumer connection might not be the immediate thing that pops to my mind as the most important, challenge for a restaurant right now. And so I would probably have the question around how you're proving ROI. But that's something that I would hope to be able to kind of talk about live.
So would you expect somebody like this, a restaurant app, to have COVID reference throughout instead of just that
not
one slide?
not necessarily throughout, but I do think that it is going to be a question that comes up. And so to the extent that you can make it really clear why they are underserved by the current solutions, especially in the current environment, I think it's just a common question that you can anticipate based on the customer set that you're targeting. So I would just emphasize making that really clear. And then slide 7, I think I saw something small that I had a question on in terms of just slide ordering, which we see all the time. So love the traction slide. I think it's really helpful. It could be a little bit easier to read. The font's a little small, but in general, seeing the milestones and where they are now, I always think is really helpful. However, they talk about at the bottom, now we're raising money, we're going to double down on user growth. And then I think I counted, it's not until 6 or 7 slides later that they actually talk about what they're raising. So I immediately have the question on, okay, you're raising now, what are you raising and what do you want to do with that? And then I kind of have to file that away and go back to it. So I do think it's helpful to think through the sequencing of some of those things. I like to treat these as conversations. So I'm expecting to kind of interact and ask questions throughout, but it's always a little bit distracting if they have to say, hold on, let me skip forward 7 slides. So that's kind of one small point, but would love to go to slide 8 actually, because this was the one that first caught my eye as something that I really wanted to go back to. So I think this is a good example of the nuances of the size of the market. So on the surface, US digital advertising is a massive market, and that's great. We love to see massive markets. However, I think that what's challenging about this market is who the competitors are. And so, and I think these numbers are from 2018. It's actually even larger in 2019. But when it comes to US digital advertising, I spent 4.5 years at Twitter. So if I sound a little bit bitter, I know how challenging these companies are as competitors. But Facebook and Google are effectively a duopoly in this market, and they account for roughly 60–70% of US digital advertising spend. So when I look at who the competitors are for a market, there are certain types of competitors that I think are more appealing on the surface. So a really fragmented market might be interesting. A market with legacy players that are inefficient and ripe for disruption might be interesting. Even Facebook and Google can be decent competitors if you are not targeting them against their core profit-making businesses. If you are going head on against Facebook and Google for digital advertising, I will definitely have questions about why a different solution is needed, how you're differentiated, and how you're going to compete to win. And so that to me is what's missing from this slide. Is
be honest with me, Amy. If
Yeah.
you see that, if you see somebody competing directly against a core business at Google, will you even respond?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Google is a phenomenal company, and they've obviously made, incredible products. They can't do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And there are tons of examples of, markets in which Google has tried to expand into and failed. And there are even, new competitors that have cropped up. I mean, I think you can take TikTok as an example of, a new platform that is starting to think about, driving new dollars towards away from Facebook and Google. So it's not to say that it's impossible. I just think you have to be really clear and prepared for the questions around how you are going to carve out market share and why there's such an important gap that you decided to tackle this, part of the market. Because I do think that sometimes you can just see, hey, there's a big market, so isn't that great? And I think certainly we like to see big markets, but I think in this case, that is just something to keep in mind.
Any last thoughts on this?
Nope, I think that we pretty much covered this one.
Great. Talia, what are your thoughts on this?
The only thing that I'd really add is, look, in a marketplace business, oftentimes building liquidity in a market and getting both sides, the flywheel to really start spinning, solving that chicken and the egg problem, that's one of the hardest things, and it takes a lot of time. And I was reflecting on towards the end of the deck, I think when talking about the funding requirements, it describes what the capital will be used for, which is great to show sort of the key sources or the key areas in which the resources will be deployed. But the thing that caught my eye here was that it'll launch in 10 cities off of just $1.5 million. And I was reminded of like the Yelp story as like as a company selling to small local businesses and doing reviews with small local venues. When they first got started, there were actually a lot of different competitors, and there was City Search, there was another company that were actually in all these markets. And everyone was like, well, how is Yelp going to get traction as this, small company? They were only in San Francisco. And actually, by nature of being in San Francisco and only focusing on San Francisco, they were able to get incredible liquidity by getting tons of local businesses, a lot of reviewers, and people who were in the market and lived there just really knew, everyone knew Yelp. Wherever you were going, you would hear about and see Yelp. And yes, they weren't in any other city for a long time, even after they had raised a Series A. But by doing that, they had such kind of clarity on how to deliver a great product and how to keep people engaged, that they actually ended up, then replicating that in just one other city, and then one other city after that. And then finally they had the playbook for expansion. And one of the things that makes me cautious about kind of marketplace businesses that are serving on a local or regional deployment is like, how do you actually build liquidity in those first few markets versus trying to be everywhere? Because sometimes by virtue of being everywhere, you're actually nowhere. So that was my main kind of question that I would have wanted to talk through and better understand the thinking with the founding team.
Great. Now we have 10 minutes left, 9 minutes actually, my producer's telling me. So I'm going to load one more here. Talia, this is your turn. A lot of color on this one. Hold on one second. I can figure things out.
Oh.
All right, there we go.
So we've got Times Square. Lots of exciting billboards. Okay, description of Alfie in the advertising space, using artificial intelligence or computer vision. Description of how the product works, using personalized advertising. Looks like it's targeted advertising, that targeted out-of-home advertising using facial recognition and a lot of different data. Little product screenshots, more product screenshots, and more descriptions of where this product could be deployed across the city. How COVID-19, much like the last deck we saw, is impacting the business or changing some of their go-to-market plans, their partners, and the team.
Oh, there's more. Context. That's it. Okay, where would you like to start?
I'll start a little bit out of order on this one, just because, the number one thing that after I saw this deck, I came away thinking, like, wow, I would love to hear the founders, they're based in the UK and in the US, like I'd love to hear their thinking and opinions on is, it feels like there's this massive elephant in the room, which is facial recognition and technology is something that a lot of consumers and governments and individuals in these countries are really sensitive about. And there's a lot of, unknown regulation around it and questions around it overall. And I think I love meeting companies that are like pushing the boundaries of the status quo, that are pushing things forward, and that may even be running up against challenging regulations. I mean, look at, Uber, Airbnb, they all had to go through and are still, battling different regulatory environments. So that's not something that we're necessarily afraid of. But what we would have loved to see here is like addressing that head on and just saying like, hey, this is the landscape. We know this is a challenge and this is how we think about addressing it. And this is how we're going to navigate that. So that was my first immediate reaction to this pitch.
We see that too with Startup Battlefield, where there's a big elephant in the room, as you called it, and it's not addressed. Is that a big turnoff?
It's a little, not having it in the deck unless you're in a meeting is something that it makes you a little bit cautious. And it's also, it's a risky decision because there's a chance that investor or prospective customer just decides that like, oh, there's this big thing here that either they're not even thinking about or like it's just too scary for us and we don't understand how you're going to address it. And so it shuts down the conversation quickly before you have a chance to really share your viewpoint. So if there's something, that is overhead that is, that degree of significance, I would encourage you to address it in some way within the deck.
Great. So you have 6 minutes left. Is there anything you want to talk on this? Other than that, I think that this deck did a really good job of kind of breaking down
and describing the product and what they were going to do, what the various inputs were going to be, and bringing to life the product experience. I came away from this deck like having a really clear understanding of what the company does or what they aspire to do with funding, and that was great. I think that one thing that would be in particular interesting to better understand here, and that was missing, two things that were missing actually, is one, understanding the high-level unit economics or financials, much like what Amy was describing a couple decks ago. This is a business that has a little bit more going on, a little more complicated. There's sensors and screens and devices, and so there's a lot of different moving pieces. And having a very high-level kind of model or projection or unit economic breakdown would be really helpful for the investor to understand, like, well, what does it actually take to get this off the ground and to get the product out there in cities? And maybe the second thing that I would have loved to see here is a little bit more on the go-to-market side. There was a slide that described the partners, and I thought there were some really amazing and great logos on that slide, but I didn't quite know, are those partners on distribution? Are those advertisers? It wasn't fully clear on that. And I would have loved to understand, like, how are you working with these companies, or how do you want to work with these different companies? And how does that help you go to market faster?
What do you see when you see these partner slides and you see the biggest companies in the world on them? What are your thoughts?
Oftentimes using great logos of well-known companies and otherwise is like a great stamp of validation for an early stage company or startup. It's saying, hey, we have these customers, or this partner has taken a bet on us, and therefore, we have a little bit more credibility. So I think sometimes that can be a huge positive. But I think telling the story as to how you're working with them or in what way is important too. What
due diligence would you do to verify these?
We would talk to these either customers or partners and ask to throughout the diligence process to better understand how they're working with the company, what the level of relationship is, and how they see the opportunity.
Great. I'm going to cut you off there, and Amy, I'm going to give you 2 minutes.
Cool. And I think Talia did a great job covering it. I think just two quick things that I would add. On this one, they're targeting the out-of-home advertising market, and I do think that this is one that maybe the average investor doesn't have as much experience in compared to digital advertising. So it might be helpful just adding a little bit more context around, is this still a growing market? What are we seeing in terms of acceleration as more people are spending more on digital? So just kind of expect that, maybe the person you're talking to doesn't have the same level of context. I do think that on the slide order, I think that while by the end, I did feel like I had a good understanding of what this company did, I had some questions in the beginning, and I think some of the screenshots that they included were a little bit hard to see in this format. And so this might be another example where a really quick demo might have been just a more compelling way to show the product off if it's done live. I had the same question on partners. I think I was certainly confused about whether these were customers, whether this is actually just their tech stack. They listed, they have a lawyer, they have G Suite. So I couldn't tell whether these are people that are paying them or people that they are paying. So I had kind of a similar question to Talia there. And then the one last thing I think on this one was on the team slide. I didn't see any logos or descriptions of their prior companies, and so would love just a little bit more about why this founding team is tackling this product specifically.
Does it bother you that Charles' image is lower resolution? Because I can't stop looking at that.
Yeah, he should have a high resolution photo.
Right.
No, that wouldn't be the first comment I would make on this slide, but no, I think overall they do a nice job.
Great. Well, I just turned off screen share, so it's back to us. And I would like to thank both of you for joining us in this inaugural Pitchdeck Teardown. We're going to do this at TechCrunch Disrupt in a couple months too, in September, where throughout the day we're going to tear down pitch decks, because it's a very valuable skill that a lot of people are always looking for more validation on. And with that, I would like to thank Amy and Talia for joining us, and for you, the audience, for joining us as well. Be sure to use CrunchMatch. It's TechCrunch's system to match entrepreneurs with founders, and you can find that on the event home screen. But for now, I'm Matt Burns, and thank you for joining us.